So, this is just a list of my favorite albums this year for Seth, who has requested this. And at number 25, there's Boulderball, the debut album of Repetentes 2008. It's incredibly bright and energetic, and it mixes disco, funk, synth excursions, all with a playful attitude of the soundtracks of early 3D platformers like Glover or Super Mario 64. Sonically, it's similar to the future funk that was an offshoot of Vaporwave, but there's way more consideration to the composition of these tracks, with a lot of elements just kind of whizzing around, as if some parts were being played at regular speed but others being sped up in double time. It's an album brimming with a lot of ideas that never really overstay their welcome. It's short and sweet, and it puts a fresh spin on this kind of sound. Ruination is Kairon IRSE's follow-up to Ujubasajuba, and it's a far cry from it. This album is full of really spacey, progressive rock. There's still elements of shoegaze, but that atmosphere is punctuated by these twists and turns into passages of psychedelic jamming, and they still keep the breathy vocals on here, which contrasts really well with the overall harder sound. Sis-boom-bah is a pretty loose and relaxed album. Juju and Jordash have always had a fluid take on house and techno, but they really stretch it to the limit here. Their music always has an exotic and funky feeling to it, which make for a lot of upbeat fun. Here, however, the focus on a few elements at once in any given track give them this unusual quality of being contemplative, but also groovy. It's much more sparse and slowed down from the usual BPM of techno and house, but this all highlights how sharp the compositions have to be in order for them not to fall apart. Forest Swords follows up Engravings with its new album Compassion. As the title suggests, it's emotive, weaving vocal samples into a blend of digital and physical instrumentation. You can pick apart a lot of things at any given moment here, and it all makes it feel like a series of epics. This is also in part how pastoral the music feels, especially with the tribal drumming and chanting throughout a lot of the tracks. It's an album full of the past that still feels entirely relevant thanks to how you can connect to it. I think Orc is the best OC's album yet. It feels harder and more energetic, but doesn't sacrifice their character in the process. Their garage rock sound is way more psychedelic this time around, especially with the two drummers, and that's pretty much what makes this record for me, the two drummers. Just having that much energy, momentum in the tracks works out so well for them. And momentum in general, I mean, the Static God is a hell of an intro. It just comes charging at you with this manic riff and a lever let's go. And animated violence as well sounds like it could be a Melvin's track, pretty much, with how heavy it is. The vocals on this are pretty fun and whimsical as well, whether it's Dwyer's almost whining or bellowing, and it kind of fits in with how fairy tale-ish the cover of the album looks as well, with that silly orc. Looks like he unlocked your iPhone and it caught him. And the same thing with the progression of the tracks aren't so straightforward. Something that keys to the castle slows down to a mellow pace that gets carried by the string section over a number of minutes. It's quite beautiful. This whole album is a lot of fun. It's like rereading a fairy tale story, but all the characters took steroids since the last time you read it. World Eater is the latest album by Blanck, and it continues a lot of the trends from Dumb Flesh, and takes them in some pretty interesting directions. The opening on this, sounding like a wind-up carousel, is pretty fitting, considering how techno, industrial, R&B, drone, footwork, and whatever else is thrown in and just blurred. One of the first things that stood out was the way he treats vocals on this album, because even though there's those gurgling, chopped-up snippets that were on Dumb Flesh, the track Resist Negative has a good amount of shrieking in it, like almost black metal, while the following one is singing that amounts to speech without text while still retaining the emotive content. The pacing in this album works much better as well, beating you over the head with its intensity, which is then sequenced with the calmer tracks. It's a pretty wild ride. It's noisy, but it's never too harsh. All the things that play here balance out with each other nicely. The spider on my head? I don't think so. No, we're good. Ariel Pink was back with his new album, dedicated to Bobby Jameson. The fact that it's dedicated to him shows itself in the music here and there, and pretty early on. The whole album is overall more sincere than his other stuff at times, with songs like I Wanna Be Young, Another Weekend, and Kitchen Witch, but it still has Ariel's humorous moments when he's singing about bubblegum or Santa Claus. It's all tied together pretty nicely with poppy hooks, some of which are also dedications to the past, like the middle of the track Time to Live. It's pretty much just the iconic part of Video Killed the Radio Star. It's less all over the place than Pom Pom was, and the decision to make a more introspective set of tracks based on the general life of Bobby Jameson really worked out here. There's not much to say about this record other than Vrăjitorul din Norz is Romanian for the Wizard of Oz. It's just a really solid set of a minimal style of deep house and techno that doesn't fall prey to being glorified DJ tools. It's really nice and warm and smooth textures on this one. Jersey Devil is actually the third Ducktails release this year. The two others are compilations with similar material. Difference being this one is relatively concise. It's really pleasant hypnagogic pop. Where Ariel Pink is sometimes being a smartass, Matt Mondeniel is just having this really sunny, peaceful, calm, good time. There's an airy feel to it, both with instrumentation and the mostly carefree lyrics, whether it's like the softness of a drum machine, delicate guitar, or these toothless, sweet synth lines. Its shameless, easygoing sound really works for it. It's really charming in places, which is great for Mondeniel. Otherwise, this would get really sappy and pretty lame with lyrics like, I have never loved a woman more than I love my mom. In any other artist's repertoire or album, this is just sorely out of place. Sounds like something I would sing about. The Next have been going for a while, and Unfold is their 19th album. It's 4 lengthy pieces of free jazz that emphasize a deceptive amount of control. The percussive elements shimmer about the bass, piano, guitar, and organ throughout the whole thing, with a slight exception of the track Blue Mountain, which really culminates in this dramatic flair. It's really nice, considering all the other tracks on this, where the improvisation is heavily rooted in this elliptical repetition. Though it's kind of disingenuous to say that this repetition stops them from translating a lot of ideas throughout the album's runtime, because it's pretty much the opposite. It's like going on a road trip, and you're always driving towards a horizon, but the scenery slightly changes in your peripheral vision. Everything is balanced really well here, and makes for a record that never veers off in a wrong direction. Galcher Lustwerk has been producing a string of EPs, and under other names, but he's finally dropped his first album under this name, it's Dark Bliss. It's in the same vein of deep house and hip hop as his earlier stuff, but things at play here really open up his sound. Though the rapping is still in this cool, subdued flow, it's more prominent. Tracks like Catamaran and Yo really draw the vocals out, and they focus your attention to and from the haziness of the rest of the track's production. And despite the harsher textures and the crunchy guitar licks and bass lines here and there, it's still smooth, confident, and a really enjoyable record. Anwar Sadat came out with their album Ersatz Living, and there's just something about post-punk bands and foreign politically loaded names. Anwar Sadat, Gang of Four, Viet Cong, Joy Division. That's just it, I guess. But at least the lyrics on this one match. Right? It's like a kick in the ass for 26 minutes. It's really cynical about warfare, generally about political turmoil and the resulting violence, but it never really drags. There's a lot of energy in the rhythm section in this album, and it really shines on the tracks like Quantum Fighter or Tatstrebe, I don't know how to pronounce that in German. It takes itself seriously, but never to the point of being boring. And if you like aggressive post-punk, no wave, or industrial rock, definitely check this out. Lee Gamble is back with Mnestic Pressure, and it's nearly half the length of his previous album. It managed to be less cohesive, but it isn't a bad thing here. He covers a lot of ground with jungle and techno, and it feels really atmospheric with these hazy pads that coat the tracks, but don't dull what's going on when you kind of zoom into everything that's kind of whizzing around. Part of that is how much stronger the drum patterns are on this record, I feel, and how the ideas feel like a step forward in some directions. Tracks like East Sadat, UE8, and Ignition Lockoff sound way more urgent than he's ever been, while Quadrupoints has these volatile synths that sound like they might evaporate at any moment. Lee Gamble's always been pretty rigorous with his approach to this kind of music, but now it's like sonic alchemy, right? The process is just bizarre, but it's just as effective. Really neat album. Actress's latest is Acid, a collection of futuristic takes on techno, house, hip-hop, and electronic music in general. One thing I really love is the sound design on this, whether it's the skittering opening track or the moments of fuzzy distortion that coexist with more sharp linear textures. Dancing in the Smoke as well as 4 and Chrome really succeed in this regard. An Actress has always operated with club music, and the repetition that goes with this style really makes you zero in on these loops that are fairly removed, even from his contemporaries. No one else really could have made the track Extreme, which is some kind of mutated banger that stops to reboot itself in the middle, but then continues on banging anyway. It's just, like, looking at the cover of this album, the analog of a chrome hand is fitting because it reflects back these things that you normally see, that are just all in an alien manner now. Dream State of a Bellmaker is this gorgeous debut by Samuel Andre Madsen. He doesn't reinvent the wheel on this album. It's just an hour plus of this nostalgic combination of deep house, techno, and ambient. The tracks do play out here at their own pace, but it never sags thanks to how emotive this manages to be. You've got this buoyant optimism in the harder hitting tracks where the drums are more in the center at the focus of the mix, while the slower ambient ones just have this dreamy quality to them. I really love it when electronic music can get this personal without resorting to cliches. And the closing track on here is a highlight. You've got like these drifting chimes and pads that kind of just float there for like 16 minutes, and it's just pure bliss. Chalice Hymnal is the newest album from the post-rock band Grails. There's a lot of variety in this one, and honestly the arrangements often give the music a cinematic vibe. Some of these tracks wouldn't honestly sound a place in a Bond movie like Casino Royale. To their credit, that is. I say this all because it manages to move all these different moods pretty cohesively. Like the track Pelham could easily be the backdrop to a car chase scene, with the insistent piano lines and the soaring guitar that's introduced a minute in. On the other hand, Rebecca has a delicate drum machine and chiming that gives way to a saxophone and double bass, and it sounds like the romantic scene with the main character's love interest. Everything on here builds up like the two previous tracks I mentioned in these lovely different ways that capture your attention before the music resolves, and the payoff when the songs reach a climax is really gratifying. After a string of EPs, Tzusing drops his first album, whose title roughly translates to Invincible East. It's a reference to a Chinese novel, and there's just as much as an influence in the music itself. Samples of bagpipes are altered to sound like Chinese horns, and the percussion is more varied and not as mindlessly pummeling as usual industrial techno and EBM. There's a lot of finesse to it too, especially in tracks like Esther, and Nature's Not Created in the Image of Man's Compassion, where the tension builds up on you. The slower tempos are also perfect for this effect. There's not a constant worry about the dance floor in this album, so Tzusing really lets the tracks progress at their own pace. And what makes this so much fun to listen to is how seamlessly it embodies Eastern tropes into techno, as if it were that simple to pull off this well. Common as Light and Love, Our Red Valley's Full of Blood is the latest Sun Kill Moon record, and to be honest, it's as much of a mouthful as whatever Kozilek rambles about on this album. There's a lot to be said here, whether it's about memories, love, mortality, Mark's general interests, or snippet of his life on any given day. It's all connected by Kozilek's stream of consciousness, which mostly isn't singing anymore, sometimes even approximates rap on here, which is another thing I love about this, because the arrangements are always a backdrop to Kozilek's rambling, and it's always soothing the mood. In particular is the track Chili Lemon Peanuts and the track Lone Star, where sections will suddenly transition to the softer and lovely passages to match Kozilek's flow. It's 2 hours long, but personally, I don't really find my attention wavering or dropping off as it would with the 2 albums before this one. Partly because, while there is sadness to this album, it's nowhere near as morose as Benji. And there are also some humorous, lighthearted parts, which lighten the mood, like the skit about being a South at Southwest, or the fake story about the murder of an Eric Clapton impersonator. It's a meandering album, but it's never aimless. Yellow is a bizarre deconstruction of punk rock. I don't know what the hell Naomi punk we're doing on this album, but where the repetition in this kind of music is usually concise, the riffs and themes here are drawn out over an hour. We've got a number of field recordings scattered to the music, as if this is all operating some larger space to match how open this is conceptually. And Naomi Punk don't only act as themselves here. They have this alter ego called the Scorpions, and the music is just as weird, really. The album opens with 2 warbling introductions before diving into a bunch of juddering tracks at half speed that are pretty much tripping over themselves. And the vocals on here are on par with that, either coming out in this disaffected glaze or just slurred right into the mix. And aside from electronic interludes My Shadow and Matroska, which are surprisingly emotive and nostalgic of the 80s, this is repeated over the course of the entire album. It's all very compelling in a disorienting way, though, like the optical illusion of that impossible staircase. Terrence Dixon comes through with almost an hour and a half themed around outer space. It's a collection of mostly short, loopy techno sketches, and the eccentricities of his production make for a really interesting listen. In particular, the drums and snares are often pushed back into the mix to give more space to the synth and bass lines, which really highlight how the patterns kind of orbit around each other in these odd fashions. The rhythms just kind of come in and out in focus, and these parts just kind of reappear and disappear. Syncopating the music like this really gives it a disjointed quality. No one really does techno like Terrence Dixon, and it's a shame that he hasn't reached a larger audience with how captivating his music is, for how uncompromising it is as well. Shackleton teams up with Anika for what sounds like an hour's worth of the Welsh renditions of the X-Files, in the best way possible, mind you. He's done 2 other collaborations recently, but this one really takes the cake for a couple of reasons. The production on this one is fantastic, with a lot of traditional percussion and sounds right next to whirring synths and drones. And the 4 tracks here subdivide into multiple sections, but the music flows naturally from being ominous to wistful to romantic. A track usually builds by picking up elements here and there, and until there's enough material for Anika to breathe life into. The lyrical themes on here are centered on love and mortality, and although Shackleton's previous collaborators were great, Anika really goes above and beyond with the emotional gravity of her voice. Whereas Ernesto Tomasini was theatrical and Vengeance Tenfold was solemn, Anika channels this kind of Oracle at Delphi vibe. She's shrouded in this cold disaffectedness that really paints all her desires and motives in an uneasy light, as if you're not getting the full picture of what's really being sung about. All at the same time, like her voice, so dynamic and fluid, it ebbs and flows with the music. It's an enchanting album that uses Shackleton's spacious electronic productions as a backdrop for her poignancy. Oxbow's Thin Black Duke channels the same aggression as her previous albums, but it does so just as well, if not better. It's rare to see a band remain this consistently good, especially with its stylistic change such as this. There are a lot of elements of symphonic rock on this album, though it still remains noisy and forceful. This all accompanies a loose narrative of the Thin Black Duke, this character that seems to be both the centerpiece and the storyteller of this album. And Robinson's vocal delivery is all over the place in a great way, going from rasping and snarling to singing in a really sobering manner. It all ties together, whether it shines a spotlight on the violence of the Duke, or whether it hits you with these personal insights into his character that never really descend into anything sappy or his platitudes. The Thin Black Duke really here is not an explicit character, but it works in its favor by juggling all these concepts without being bogged down by too many details. And Oxbow just managed to come through with a lot of maturity and control, both sonically and lyrically, which is a real pleasure considering this album comes after almost 30 years into their career. The Saddle Veen is pretty much the quirkiest thing I've heard this year. It's really something else. With this album, Son of Ra draws a parallel between the mythic arc of Hercules and American cowboys, and the music reflects just as much. I don't know where you got this insight, but it's really interesting. You've got the landmarks of harmonica, flutes, and steel pedal guitar that are completely twisted by how warbling and abstract the synths and vocals are in this one. What's being said is just as straightforward, with animals talking about thermodynamics and flaming swords, or just simple cowboy imagery that gets blurred into nonsense. For instance, the track Campfire pretty much does sound like a campfire out in the nighttime desert if it were reimagined by Squidward in the... What's that episode where he goes into the future, right? The time machine, and everything's chrome, and he starts doing those sit-ups because he's so freaked out. That's a lot of this album. This doesn't make it inaccessible, though. It's a psychedelic rock album that doesn't bore you with the usual tropes of what comes with this. It's creative, fun, and sentimental in a really down-to-earth way, especially with that Bob Dylan cover at the end. I wasn't expecting it, but it was just... I don't know, it's a really nice highlight that kind of contrasts with how loopy the rest of this is. Two things that can be really lame are folk music and lyrical references to the medieval period. A lot of the time, because these elements don't exist outside of themselves, they're pretty insular because they're just kind of there. Like whether or not they contribute to making great music feels like an afterthought to their addition to the music. Unfortunately, this is never the case with Richard Dawson, who does a great job of building his own world on his 6th solo album, Peasant. The whole thing is set in the early Middle Ages, and it details the life of a variety of characters, all of which are facing some sort of trouble or struggle in their lives. For the most part, you can piece together the stories, all thanks to the imagery that you're being painted in your head. You've got all these archaic terms and language, down to the exact process of creating dye in this period of time, which is pretty neat. I like all these attentions to detail. Even when there are blank spots in the narrative, they're always intuitively filled in with your imagination, which is given plenty of material to work with here. The song titles are also a frame of reference for a lot of the stories here. Take the track Ogre, for example, where the developing fear in the track is given the origin point, and at that point the story just kind of clicked for me, and I'd be clueless otherwise, to be honest. As for the music, it really opens up to you, and it gets in your personal space. It's pretty much a difference between seeing someone jogging or running from afar versus being really close up to them to see the beads of sweat trickling down their face. That's how it sounds, kind of. Everything squeaks and strains in an intimate way. At times it sounds very melodic, and at others it gets really dissonant and breaks down the convention with bursts of noise. And it's the same thing with Dawson's voice, depending on the mood of his characters. Whether it's the sad, beautiful voice of a woman sold into prostitution as a child, or the angry defiance of a whole village, the heartbreak of a soldier off to war, or despair of a massage therapist or masseuse. I don't know. They call massage therapists back then or just masseuses. Well, Dawson does have the talent to breathe life into this type of music, where many, many other people are just awkwardly stuck doing CPR. But my favorite album this year is definitely Uncanny Valley by Stabscotch. And it's an album that takes cues from progressive rock, metal, and noise and just warps it all into a stream of frantic aggression. It's honestly a breath of fresh air right now. I mean, you got a lot of current scenes of rock music that are just kind of reviving their influences and absorbing them in predictable ways that sometimes you don't really care for. Yeah, but this is really intense, and no less intense is their vocalist Tyler Blensdorf, who phases through frustration, anguish, and this fervent hysteria, all of which, on my understanding of the lyrics, which are very open here, are all focused toward finding some sort of clarity in life and some kind of direction. And even though it's fairly open-ended with, like, just, I don't know, it seems like word salads, kind of, sometimes phrases strung together for the emotional effect each word might just bring. It's tied together by the splashes of emotion in the music and his voice. You've got some more approachable tracks on here too, like Unknown Pleasures and Tannic. Approachable in the sense that you can make sense of them. Or there's a Wrestle for Control and Self-Determination lyrics, and it kind of reflects as much of the music. But I don't know, that's kind of the exception to the norm. It's a really cryptic album where there are a lot of references to nature and mythology, the more of which kind of add to the atmosphere of how wonky this is. A really wonky type of evil. I don't know how to describe it. Like Simpsons, but Homer actually wants to strangle Bart for real, but he's strangling himself for real. I don't know if I should cut that out or not. It didn't make much sense. I'll just keep it in. In this regard, like one of the tracks, I think it's the 8th track on here. I can't even pronounce it because the name is like a combination of English and Cyrillic. It figures, right? And it's this apocalyptic, like kind of loose narration of, like it sounds like the Book of Revelations, honestly. This kind of ritual. And speaking of Revelations, I mean, this whole album is kind of a revelation of what you can do with rock music the current year. I just really like it. It's really open-ended, and you can just sound so honest and sincere. Partly because like he just kind of lays himself, Blensdorf really lays himself bare here, and so does the instrumentation. It really kind of like strives to be itself and nothing but itself. That's quite nice. And that's pretty much it. Those are my 25 favorite albums this year, and I hope you like this video.